In this video, we are going to talk about how fragments interact with action bars. It's actually not going to be that difficult or that complicated. So it'll seem a little bit anticlimactic after the last video when we showed you how to put together this example application, but nevertheless it showed us a good example of using fragments and got us some pretty good practice in writing them. But in this video we're just going to focus on the action bar and talk about how it can be used with fragments, and I think this is really important. So yeah, I guess let's go ahead and get started. For you guys who didn't watch the last video, you're basically looking at the app that we put together. It's really straightforward. Basically what we have are two fragments. And one fragment is accessed by clicking on page 1, and the next fragment is accessed by clicking on page 2. So we have kind of this tab control thing going on. Now, just like how I said in the last video, it's not that this is the best way to do tabs or that I would recommend creating tabs like this, but it was really a great little bit of practice we got playing around with fragments. Anyway, so this video, I'm just concerned about the action bar. I'm concerned about how we can get buttons on and off the action bar when we select different fragments. Because if you have an application that takes advantage of fragments and uses fragments to support multiple screen sizes and all that fun stuff, you're really going to want the action bar to be contextual. You want the action bar to only display items that are appropriate given what's on the screen. So in this case, what's on the screen? We have our activity itself, the main layout, and we also have a fragment. And now it could be page 1, or it could be page 2. Now you can expand this example in your mind to envision maybe you have multiple fragments on the screen, and there could be any combination of fragments on the screen, and it just... how do you handle that? How do you handle those fragments interacting with the action bar, as well as allowing the main activity to interact with the action bar? Because obviously, when I click on settings, up here in the overflow menu, I'm still wanting the main activity to perform whatever operation it has associated with that button, and without it being sent to the fragments themselves. So let's go ahead and get started. Again, this will be a really short, straightforward video. Basically, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to come up here into my page 2 fragment. And no, I'm going to start off with my main activity, actually. The reason I'm starting off with main activity is I want to give my settings menu some behavior. I'm wanting it to do something that indicates that it was pressed and indicates that the main activity handled that button. So, of course, the place that I do that is down here on the On Options Items Selected method. And I'll go ahead and nuke the comments so things are a little bit more clear. And right here, I'm going to say if ID is rid.actionSettings, which if you recall is the ID, well, for people who didn't see the last video, it is the ID of the menu item that we have in the pre-generated blank activity template file. So this is our action settings. So if we clicked on that, I'm going to go ahead and say, I'm going to say toast.makeToast, passing in this as the context, and passing in main activity settings clicked, exclamation point, and passing in a toast.length short for the length, and of course invoking show at the end, otherwise the toast wouldn't have shown. Okay, so that is our action settings. It just displays a toast, not too exciting. So another question is if I'm on page 2, I want a menu item to appear, and if I'm off page 2, I want a menu item to disappear. Now there's a couple ways we could do this. We could certainly absolutely come in here and get a reference to the action bar and muck around with it, or mess around with a reference to the menu object, invalidate the menu options. We could come up here into main activity, and on the on create options menu, we could say if page 2 is being displayed, add these items. If it's not, don't add those items. Then, when we switch pages, we can say invalidate options menu, which will force main activity to recreate its own options menu, and it'll recreate it with the proper items. But that really breaks the whole concept of encapsulation. We want the responsibility of which menu items are available on the action bar to rest solely in the fragment itself, or the fragment that is going to be displaying those items. So we want to come in here, we want to introduce some menu options. So it turns out there's a really easy way to do this. And it starts, like most things with Java, with overriding a method. So I'm going to say at override, public void on create option. That's not how you spell options. That's not how you spell options either. Options menu, inflator. All right, so what's going on here? Well, we have an on create options menu, and as you see, it's very, very similar to our on create options menu in our main activity. There's a couple differences, of course. First of all, the parameter list. You'll notice that we take in not only the menu that we're inflating, but we also take in a menu inflator as well. You notice that that's different than the activity. With the activity, we get the menu inflator from itself. This is really just a matter of convenience for us. Another change that you see here is that it returns void, which I find particularly interesting, because you notice right here in the on create options menu, it returns a boolean, and that boolean indicates whether or not an options menu was created. You'll see here in a moment that we specify whether or not an options menu exists in a fragment in a completely different way than we do in an activity. So what I'm going to do here is the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to invoke super.onCreate options menu, passing in menu and inflator. Now, the super class, or the super method, actually has no implementation, as you can see right here. So it's not too interesting. However, for methods like these, I really do like to get in the habit of invoking the super type, or the super method, rather. It's not going to make a difference either way. I think it's just a little cleaner. Anyway, we do super on create options menu, and then we, well, create the options menu. And how do we do that? Well, we simply use the inflator. So we say inflator.inflate, passing in a menu resource, which we access through r.a menu resource. In this case, it's going to be, let's go ahead and just call this fragment underscore page 2 for the menu. And of course, the second parameter to this method is going to be the menu itself that's going to be inflated, or rather, the object where our inflated menu is going to be passed into. So then we'll go ahead and pass in menu. For fragment underscore page 2, I'm going to place my keyboard cursor in the error, in the red part that's saying that they can't find this symbol. I'm going to hit Alt-Enter, to create the appropriate menu resource. Everything looks good. There's really no other defaults that I want to give it, so I'll go ahead and hit Enter. Inside this menu, I'm going to create an item, and the item I'm going to give an ID of ID/fragment page 2 menu thing 1. Sure, that's an awful name. We'll go with it. We'll give it a title of thing 1, and we'll give it an icon. Let's go ahead and give it that icon of that thing we got before, our mitmap IC launcher. So at mitmap / and then I hit Control Space and it auto-completed to IC launcher. Of course, you would want your own little icon, or a more appropriate icon for a production application, but since that icon is lying around, we are just going to use it. We can go ahead and fix our preview again preemptively by changing the preview theme to Material Light Dark Action Bar and hitting OK, so that we can now see the preview of what our menu is going to look like. And in fact, by showing the preview, it totally reminded me of something I forgot, which is to specify that I want this item to actually appear as an action item, not as an overflow item. And of course we do that by doing app, and by typing in app, you'll notice that, or app : you'll notice we get an assist to help us type in that XML namespace. So we'll take advantage of that and hit Alt-Enter. And of course what that does is that brings in our XML namespace app, which points to that particular URL. And we'll say app, and we'll say show as action, and we will specify that as always. Now by doing that, you see it went out of the overflow menu, and it now appears on the action bar as an icon, just like how we want. Alright, so that's all awesome. So, in our fragment, let's go ahead and just, well, if I hit play right now, what do you think would happen? You might think, well, it actually looks pretty clear that when you select page 2, that item should appear on the menu bar, and if you're on page 1, it shouldn't. So it should appear and disappear depending on which page you are. Now, you'd be almost correct. However, remember back when I said that fragments have a different mechanism for determining if it even has an options menu to begin with? Well, it does. And instead of returning Boolean on the onCreate options menu, you have to set a flag in the onCreate view method that tells Android that this fragment has an options menu and for it to do its options mergey thing. So to do that, up here on my onCreate view method, I'm going to say set has options menu, and I'm going to specify that as true. By doing that, Android will now query my onCreate options menu and use whatever items that I added as the menu items for this fragment. So now I can go ahead and hit play, and I can test out my code. The first thing I want to test out is to make sure that my click handler on my main activity options menu works, and then I want to make sure that the appropriate menu item appears when I select page 2. So let's select our settings option. So coming up here to our action bar, clicking on our overflow and clicking on settings, we now see main activity settings changed, or settings clicked rather. So that means that the main activity is receiving events. When we click on page 2, notice what happens. We now have a new menu item. So this new menu item comes from the menu that was inflated for the fragment. If we go back to page 1, it disappears. Page 2, it appears. Page 1, it disappears. Blah, blah, blah. Super exciting. That is a menu item coming from a fragment. Now, of course, when I click it, you don't see anything happening. And when I go back up to my main activity settings, you see my main activity still works. So how do we intercept this message? It actually turns out that in order to handle a click event on a fragment action bar item, and we're going to add a very, very familiar looking method. Down here underneath onCreate options menu, I'm going to go ahead and write a public Boolean. And can you guys guess what this method's going to be named? On options item selected. Now, what do you think the parameter is going to be? Menu item. Item. And let's go ahead and for our default, we'll return super.on options menu item selected, passing an item. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if item.getID equals r.id fragment page 2 menu thing 1. I'm going to say toast.makeToast. Now this is interesting. For the first argument that I'm going to pass into toast, it's requiring that I pass in a context. Now what is a context? Well, a context is one of the top level objects in Android. You have two contexts that you normally deal with. One is an activity context and one is an application context. Either one would work for this parameter, but in this case, I want to be as specific as I can and pass in the more specific activity context. And I can do that very simply inside of my fragment by invoking the getActivity method. Because of course the getActivity method returns the activity that is owning this fragment. Anyway, for the next parameter, it's going to ask me for a bit of text, and in this case I'm going to say page 2 fragment thing 1 clicked. For the duration, I'm going to say toast.length short. Then I'm going to return true. Now, the return type here is really important, and we'll talk about that here in a second. First, of course, lint caught me again. I really do like all the sanity checks they put into this IDE, because you notice the whole uglified, highlighted code right there. Well, it turns out I forgot to invoke the show method on my toast, and my toast was never shown, which is a very sad toast. Okay, let's go ahead and hit play and see what happens. You guys should be able to figure out what's going to happen, but I just want to hit play, make sure that everything is working correctly, and show you guys exactly what we're looking at. And let's go ahead and select page 2, and let's click the button. Check that out. Page 2 fragment thing 1 clicked. Sweet. Okay, so at this point you might be thinking, wow, that's pretty straightforward. There's not a whole lot else to say about fragments and option menus. Well, there is. Unfortunately, or fortunately rather, it's really neither fortunate nor fortunate. But it is something that I have to stress, and is incredibly important that people memorize about working with fragments and action bars. In fact, one of the main reasons why I wanted to make this its own video instead of telling you guys, go read the docs, it's not that hard. Basically, there is a processing pipeline when you click on an options menu item. What do I mean by that? Well, when you click on an item, it goes through a pipeline of different methods that are invoked. And at any point, those methods can choose for that pipeline to be stopped. That is what the Boolean return type of the onOptionsItemSelected method signifies. Basically, when you click on an item on your action bar, one of the buttons, the first thing that's going to be invoked is your activity. And your activity's onOptionItemSelected method gets to choose whether or not it gets to handle that. That's why right here, we are saying return true. But right here, we're saying return super. And if I controlled click on this, you'll notice the super returns false. So basically, the default return value for onOptionsItemSelected is false, unless we return true ourselves. So what is the implication of this? What does returning true or false matter? Well, let's look at an example. I'm going to say if ID equals RID fragment menu thing 1, toast make toast this main activity. I have eaten, or ate, wow, have eaten your event. Toast length short dot show dot return true. Okay, so what do you think this is going to do? Well, if I hit play, you should be able to kind of figure this out from, I guess, just the context of why I would write something like that. Basically, when I select page 2 here and I hit this button, look at that. I don't get the functionality from my fragment. I get the functionality from my main activity. My main activity has eaten the event. So it has intercepted the event, handled it, and then told Android, this event is done. I don't want you passing this event to any fragments. And it doesn't. And the event stops there. That is the significance of returning true on these methods. When you return true, you are eating the event, and the event will not be processed by other fragments. So that's important to understand that in option menu button clicking processing, it is handled by your activity first, and your activity gets to decide if it moves on to your fragments. And then your fragments, furthermore, depending on what order they get invoked in, get to decide if it moves on from there. Now, of course, in this particular example, you'll notice that we only have one fragment visible at any given time, meaning there's only one fragment that the events can be passed into. But you can imagine how things get a little bit more complicated if we had multiple fragments on the screen at the same time. Anyway, just a caveat that you guys need to be aware of, and it's really not a really non-issue when you follow the rules. When you follow the rules, it's not a big deal. When you follow the rules by making sure your IDs are unique, so you don't have conflicting action bar IDs. Making sure that you always return true if you handle the event, false if otherwise. Things like that. If you follow the rules, you shouldn't run into a collision. But I'm stressing this, and I'm repeating myself multiple times about this, because it's very important that if you run into a circumstance where your fragment is not receiving an event you expect it to, the first thing you need to look at are all the activity that's responsible and all of the other fragments that may be short-circuiting that event before it reaches the fragment that you expect it to. So this will save you a lot of time if you just memorize this fact soon enough, or as soon as possible. And the docs don't actually do a great job of talking about this particular thing either. Anyway, that's really about it. There's not a whole lot else to talk about in regards to fragments and action bars. It's as easy as it can be with only a handful of caveats. So I guess we will see you guys in the next video.